Alright, well, hello there YouTube, Best Creek Gaming here with another defense video. Yeah, that's what I'm going to start calling them now, defense videos. I just may make my own videos of argumentation, so we'll see how that goes. This is the Watchmaker Argument debunked by Rationality Rules. We're going to jump straight into this. I don't want this video to be long, however, this is my most favorite video. That's a lie. This is my most famous argument for the existence of God. Let's go ahead and just jump straight into this.
Most famously presented by William Paley.
You know, you could do something like that, Stephen. Just throwing it out there.
In his theological work titled Natural Theology, the watchmaker analogy is a recurring argument for a designer, which, by way of analogy, asserts...
Incorrect. Well, yes and no. So let me just say first off, it's a major misconception, the way I say it, misconception, that Paley's argument is an argument by analogy. This actually is incorrect. He actually argues from inference to the best explanation, which everyone thinks, or let me rephrase it, which a lot of people think is another misconception, which comes from Darwin, but it was first popularized by William Paley. So throwing that out there. Sorry, Stephen, for interrupting. Let's go ahead.
For a designer, which, by way of analogy, asserts that complexity requires a designer. The way Paley put it is essentially as follows. If you were walking across a field and saw a watch lying upon the ground, you wouldn't assume that it had come together by chance because it is too ordered and complicated. Rather, you would assume that it had a conscious and intelligent designer. By way of analogy, Paley then went on to argue that because life, and indeed the universe, is ordered and complicated, it too must have had a conscious and intelligent designer. While Paley's presentation of this argument is the most famous, since his time many theists and deists have developed versions of their own. For example, Ray Comfort often uses the analogy of a painting and a painter, while Ian Duby is fond of using the analogy of a building and a builder. However, despite the many versions of this argument, they are all fundamentally the same. They assert that complexity requires a designer.
Not necessarily. So the argument in itself doesn't state that, so if we're generalizing this, it doesn't state that, or simplifying I should say, it doesn't state that complexity requires a designer. It states more so that ordered complexity requires a designer. That's a key term, order, in it.
So what exactly is wrong with this argument? I mean, the title of this video promises to debunk it. And yet we're a minute in and we haven't even started. So, beginning with its most critical flaws, let's get on with it. First and foremost, and what single-handedly debunks the watchmaker argument, is that it's a false analogy. An analogy is a comparison between things that have similar features for the purpose of explaining a principle or an idea. And in this case, Paley insists that a comparison can be made between the complexity of a watch and the complexity of the universe, which both imply that they had a designer.
Yes, so so just to simplify the argument as much as I can, the watch has has much complexity. Let me rephrase it. The watch is very complex, yet ordered. It has ordered complexity. From experiential knowledge, we know that ordered complexity comes from an intelligence or a mind. And whenever an intelligence, whenever something complex is ordered, it is done so for a purpose. So, since the watch has ordered complexity, we can infer from the best we can make the inference to the best explanation that the watch had a designer and was not made by self-organizing matter. In the same way, the universe has ordered complexity if we apply Newtonian physics. Therefore, the universe, just like the watch, had a designer that was intelligent.
However, the last step is flawed because it concludes that because two things share one quality in common, that being complexity, they must also share another quality in common, a designer, when this simply cannot be logically concluded. If it could, then by using the same faulty logic, countless other absurd qualities could be attributed to the universe. For example, the watch is complex, the watch was invented in the 15th century. The universe is complex, therefore the universe was invented in the...
Okay, I think this is where he's getting confused. So he's making the objection as if the argument was an argument by analogy, but rather it's an argument from inference using an analogy to illustrate to those who may not understand. Well, let me rephrase it. To illustrate the argument in itself. Because you could just simply do a purely logical argument from inference, and you can come to the same conclusion, perhaps stronger, but it doesn't, to those who don't understand, for example, advanced philosophy of religion or advanced logic, or like, if you don't know a lot about philosophy, you're not going to catch it. So that's why it was done for an argument from inference using an analogy.
The 15th century.
So this objection here does not necessarily apply.
Just because two objects share one quality in common, this doesn't necessarily mean that they share another.
And this is true. However, because, sometimes we do we're pattern-seeking animals. So sometimes we'll put two patterns together that are non-related. So as this says here on, thou shalt not commit logical fallacies, he's saying that I presumed that a real or perceived relationship, or let me rephrase it. He's saying here that the arguments presume, has a presupposition of a real or perceived relationship between things means that one is the cause of the other. So it goes to describe further that many people confuse correlation, things that happen together or in sequence, for causation, that one thing actually causes the other to happen. But this is this is something I would like to emphasize that they are explaining here. Sometimes correlation is coincidental, or it may be attributable to a common cause. And here is important to say, because Paley is noting that that the correlation, I guess one may say, between design and complexity is extreme. That is being that everything that has a design, whether it's by accident or by purpose that we know of, has a designer. So the correlation is extreme in many, 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 many cases, which is not even coincidental. It's extremely, in the most extreme cases, in the most extreme of the majority of cases, coincidental. So I don't know if I worded that right. So it's essentially saying that there's too many cases of correlation for it not to be coincidental. So he's saying not only is it coincidental, but he believes that it's attributable to a common cause, and that common cause has to be intelligent and has to have a mind, and that intelligent designer is what we call God. Now, continuing on.
Hence, right from the get-go, the Watchmaker argument is a false analogy. A second objection, and one very closely related to the first, is that it commits a false cause fallacy. It does this by asserting that complexity and order can only be caused by a designer.
Yes, that is what he's saying.
When not only has this never been proven to be true, it has actually been proven to be complete.
I'm sorry, what did you say, bro?
Been proven to be true. It has. When not only has this never been proven to be true.
Yes, this has been proven to be true. My Android phone has ordered complexity in it. I'm going to make the best. And I have no idea who made this. I had no idea if it just came by itself. I never did any research as to how it was made, if it was made by someone. and yet I can make the inference to the best explanation that it had a designer. The computer which I'm doing this video on has ordered complexity within it, not even talking about the digital code, which via experiential knowledge, pretty sure I had a designer. The new microphone that I'm talking in, pretty sure I had a designer. The external hard drive that this is connected to the USB cord, to the wireless USB, which connects to my wireless mouse. On this desk, which has ordered complexity, it's not necessarily complex, but to a child it would be incredibly complex. You would assume that it has a designer. There are so many applicable cases in an extreme number of which ordered complexity, or as he puts it, complexity and order is caused by a designer. I mean, does he not have a computer?
It has actually been proven to be completely incorrect.
We're talking about a watch.
But we'll get to evolution in just a second.
Yeah, see? So the whole point is that first we have to talk about the watch, and then we can make it into an analogy for life. He's just talking about life.
Essentially, like...
You see what he did there? Do you see what he did there? A little trick.
All false cause fallacies, the Watchmaker argument mistakenly confuses correlation with causation. It recognizes a relationship between complexity and designers, and then concludes that one necessarily implies the other. To once again demonstrate this flaw through an unrelated example, we can take a look at the following. Temperatures have been rising over the past few centuries, whilst at the same time the number of pirates have been decreasing. Thus, pirates call the world and global warming is a hoax. There may be a correlation between temperatures and pirates, just as there is a correlation between complexity and designers, but this doesn't necessarily mean that one implies the other. And this brings us
So, before we even get to the actual
comfortably to yet another major problem with the Watchmaker argument. It completely ignores evolution by natural selection.
This is actually false, but we'll get to that in a moment.
Without getting into it too deeply, natural selection has been completely and utterly proven to be an unconscious process that has given rise to countless complex and purposed organisms, which, without an understanding of natural selection, do indeed give the impression that they were deliberately designed. Or in other words, we know for a fact that nature can, does, and has produced remarkably complex organisms without a conscious and intelligent hand behind it.
Okay, I'm gonna go and stop you there. Can't believe I gotta talk about this. The second chapter of natural theology, or evidences of the existence and attributes of the deity collected from the appearances of nature, he talks about natural selection. Now, before people start flipping their boat, okay, we're not talking about natural selection as we know it today. Okay, we are. Now, before Darwin, there was Paley, where this argument comes from. Before Paley, there was Hume. Now, Hume talked about a principle of order that governs individual parts of nature. So, what he said, essentially, is why does an intelligence have to govern everything, or every single little thing, when we know that there are principles of order governing its own individual parts of nature? For example, there are individual principles of order governing the laws of regeneration, regeneration of cells, generation of new creations of babies, regeneration of cells, photosynthesis of biology, and then physics, weak and strong nuclear forces, principle of order governing physics. And so he hypothesized, why does it have to be a mind? Why can it not just be a principle of order that we just simply don't know yet? So Paley went on, and he actually made a caveat to this, where he states in his fifth caveat, nor fifthly would it yield his inquiry more satisfaction to be answered that there existed in things a principle of order, i.e. natural selection. Because at this time, the concept of natural selection was alive, but was not popularized or refined until Darwin. So when they talk about a principle of order in biology, they are talking about the concept of natural selection, because that was a thing back then. They just never had a name for it. So continuing on, which had this that there existed in things a principle of order which had disposed the parts of the watch into their present form and situation. He, being the person who accepts the conclusion of intelligent designer, never knew a watch made by the principle of order, nor can he even form to himself an idea of what is meant by a principle of order distinct from the intelligence of the watchmaker. So just in the watch, he's saying anyone who accepts the conclusion never knew a watch made by the principle of order. So no one knows of a watch, a literal mechanical watch, being made by the principle of order, nor can he ever formulate to himself an idea of what it is meant by a principle of order distinct from the intelligence of the watchmaker. Now, substitute watch with life and principle of order with natural selection. So the person who accepts this conclusion never knew life to be made by natural selection, but rather natural selection governs once life is already here. Nor can he even formulate to himself an idea of what it is meant to be a principle of order distinct from the intelligence of the watchmaker. Not saying that you have to deny natural selection or the principle of order, but rather, how can you formulate the idea of natural selection since natural selection only let me say it. It's a genetic fallacy. He's calling out here. You can explain how life can progress and how we can get new species and how we can get what's the word I'm looking for? More beneficial adaptations, etc., via natural selection. But just because you can, so he's calling out a genetic fallacy, just because you can explain life and how it can evolve now does not mean that you've already explained, does not mean you've therefore explained away where it came from. You know, it's like saying that we discover morality. Okay, that's good for you, but just because you discover something doesn't mean you know where it came from. That's what he's saying here in a sense. He cannot formulate to himself an idea of what is meant by natural selection or the principle of order, distinct from the intelligence of the watchmaker. So to Paley, you can explain how you can have natural selection. It's permissible to explain how new species evolve and how people and animals evolve to adapt to their environment. But how do you make that distinction from the intelligence of the watchmaker? Because you can explain how new species evolve now, but you cannot explain where they came from in the first place, or how that such a principle is even to how a principle of order governing this general biology can be distinct from the intelligence of the life maker, so to speak, or the intelligent designer. So, continuing on. On top of that, he dedicates an entire chapter to talking about that specific principle of order, or natural selection, where he says, quote, "Suppose in the next place that the person who found the watch should after some time discover that in addition to all the properties which he had hitherto observed in it, it possessed the unexpected property of producing in the course of its movements another watch-like self. The thing is conceivable, that it contained within it a mechanism, a system of parts, a mold for instance, a complex adjustments of ladders, lathes, files, and other tools, evidently and separately calculated for this purpose. Let us inquire what effect ought such a discovery have upon this former conclusion." So essentially what he's saying is, same thing here, natural selection, or this principle of order, a mechanism, a system of parts, whatever, which is separately calculated for this purpose of adaptation and evolution within species. But just because you can explain how that works doesn't explain where it came from in the first place. You know, it's very simple. Like you can explain how a law works, doesn't mean you don't know where it came from or who signed the law to make it into effect. So this is going to continue.
The truth of the matter is that the reason we recognise a watch as designed actually has nothing to do with how complex and purposed it is, but rather it is because we already know that the watch was designed.
False. So his very first caveat, he says, quote, "Nor would it, I apprehend, weaken the conclusion of intelligent design that we had never seen a watch made, that we had never known an artist capable of making one, that we were altogether incapable of executing such a piece of workmanship ourselves, or of understanding it what manner it was performed, all this being no more than what it is true of some exquisite means of ancient art, of some lost arts, and to the generality of mankind of the more curious productions of modern manufacture. Does one man in a million know how oval frames are turned? Ignorance of this kind exalts our opinion of the unseen and unknown artist's skills, if he be unseen and unknown, but raises no doubt in our minds of the existence and agency of such an artist at some former time and in some place or other. Nor can I perceive that it varies at all the inference, whether the question arises concerning a human agent, or concerning an agent of a different species, or an agent possessing in some respects a different nature. So essentially what he's saying is you don't go to a cave painting and assume, oh, I like the way how matter self-organized itself into a painting of people, of cavemen hunting down buffalo. That's nice. You wouldn't say that. Just because you don't know the design doesn't mean there's no designer. You wouldn't say what I just said, oh, I like the way matter reorganizes itself into such a beautiful fashionable design. No, you would say, oh, I wonder who drew that. Who? A person. Wonder what person drew that. What mind, what intelligence. So that's what he's saying here. So this is false. This is something we'll continue.
We have literally millions of examples of watches being created by a designer, and 0 examples of watches being made without a designer.
True and not true. So yes, we do have millions of examples of watches being made by designers, but we do have examples of it being made by those who are not designers, those who are not persons. What I'm talking about is machines that build watches, which is a thing, which I guess, I don't know why it's a thing, but it's a thing. So, yeah, but, just like natural selection, the principle of order governing biology, you still have to explain, okay, well then where did that machine come from? Who designed the machine that designs?
However, and in contrast, we have 0 examples of life being created by a designer, and literally millions of examples of nature creating complex life.
See, I think that's his mistake. So he assumes that natural selection goes all the way back to the beginning of first life. But just as he likes to say, it's never been demonstrated, because we're no longer in the realm, we're exiting philosophy and entering science. So how can you demonstrate that of which cannot be demonstrated? You can't. You have to use philosophical argumentation. Okay? Unless you want to build a time machine. But then you have endgame problems. So, with respect to life, what does he say again?
Being created by a designer. And
oh yeah, zero cases of life being created by a designer. How does he know that? He assumes that. So, if we accept the proposition, or let me phrase this, if we accept the premise that DNA acts exactly like a language, then so let me rephrase this. if we accept the premise that DNA acts like a language, okay, then because we know from experiential knowledge that all languages are based on mathematical principles, or laws, I guess you can say, upon which minds are used, intelligent minds are used to create and invent the languages, then DNA, therefore, is a created language. And the reason and the reason I say that is because I'm going to quote to you. So, information scientist Hubert Yockey from the University of California at Berkeley makes it clear that the comparison between the English alphabet and the genetic alphabet of DNA is not an analogy. And he emphasizes it's not an analogy, but rather one of mathematical identity. So he writes, and I quote, "It is important to understand that we are not reasoning by analogy. The sequence hypothesis applies directly to the protein and the genetic text, as well as to written language, and therefore the treatment is mathematically identical," unquote, which was taken from Hubert Yockey's Self-Organization, The Origin of Life Scenarios and Information Theory, published in 81. So yeah. The alphabet of DNA is identical to our English alphabet in terms of its ability to communicate a message, except that genetic alphabet has only 4 letters instead of 26. So just as the specific order of the letters in the sequence communicates a unique message, the specific order of A, T, C, and G within a living cell determines the unique genetic makeup of that living entity. Another name for that message or information, whether it's in the sentence or its DNA, is specified complexity. In other words, it's not only complex, but it also contains a specific message. But you know what? I actually got off track. That's a topic for another time. But what I'm saying is that DNA is called the Book of Life, and it's called the Book of Life for a reason. And if we make a simple argument, any type of book, digital or print, has ordered information, or one may say ordered complexity. We'll just say ordered information. And books have a designer. DNA is called the Book of Life by the scientific community, and there's a general consensus on this. Therefore, DNA, the Book of Life, has an intelligent designer. Do you see where I'm going at? So you kind of see why I'm a little iffy on what he says here.
Literally millions of examples of nature creating complex life.
And he says nature creating complex life, but it never creates... We've never observed the first life coming. The only thing we've observed is the life that we already have here and its evolution henceforth. And of course, we can go back several thousand years, or if you want to use the current standard, the standard model, then we can go back several million years, and there's hardly any change, especially the one fish that was supposedly 90 million years old but hasn't changed at all in its skeletal form. So, continuing on.
A fourth major flaw with the Watchmaker argument is that it either commits a special pleading fallacy or that it's completely self-refuting. Its core premise asserts that purpose and complexity requires a designer.
Yes and true. So the watch, which has ordered complexity for a purpose, using experiential knowledge, we can make the best inference to the best explanation is that the watch has a designer.
And so if we draw the Watchmaker argument out to its logical conclusion, that there is a God and that it...
Yes, just replace what I just said with a watch and the universe.
...created the universe and everything in it, then by applying the argument's logic to itself, we must conclude that that God too had a designer.
False. I don't know why I feel like this is a misrepresentation of the argument. Either he's a liar or he's ignorant of it. However, I have watched some of his videos. He is pretty smart, so I'm just gonna say he's ignorant on this very specific topic, because he says that the designer is complex, therefore the design has a designer. This is interesting. So the theological basis of designer, quote unquote, is simple, which is divine simplicity, if I remember correctly. So the simple designer is complex. Or let me rephrase it. The simple designer has ordered complexity. Already we're hitting a wall. We're hitting a wall here. So this part does not apply. It's like saying, what actualized the potential of the unactualized actualizer? Or what caused the first cause itself uncaused? Do you see where I'm getting at? What caused the intelligent designer itself undesigned? Do you see where I'm getting at? It doesn't work at all. This is like 5th grade level stuff. Come on.
And so on and so forth for infinity. By definition, special pleading is an argument in which the speaker deliberately creates an exception to their argument without justifying why. And
True. This is true. However, I was gonna say Bailey. Sorry. In Paley's book, yes, he specifically he does do a special pleading, but not a fallacy. So he creates an exemption to his rule, but justifies it using philosophical argumentation based on his Christian theology as to why this case deserves exemption. So already, even if his arguments fail, which I read it and doesn't seem to fail, how do I put it? By definition, it's already not a fallacy.
And that is precisely what one must do to prevent the Watchmaker argument from being completely self-refuting. Hence, the Watchmaker argument is either self-refuting or it commits a special pleading fallacy.
Well, I guess it has to be self-refuting because it's not special pleading.
Despite the fact that each of the previous 4 objections single-handedly defeat the Watchmaker argument on their own, here are just some additional issues to add insult to injury. The Watchmaker argument is self-contradicting. The argument first assumes that a watch is different from nature, which
is true. It does assume that it's different from nature. A mechanical nature versus a biological nature.
Indirectly claims is uncomplicated and random.
What?
Is uncomplicated and random. Which it indirectly claims is uncomplicated and random.
Where does it say that? Let's read what he says. So the argument first assumes that a watch is different from nature, yes, which it indirectly claims is uncomplicated and random. What is the whole part is ordered the argument is ordered complexity. Ordered complexity. How does it make an indirect claim that it's uncomplicated? Complexity is complicated. Being complex is complicated. And it's not that it's random. It's random that you find a watch while you're stubbing your toe on a stone. But it's not random in the sense that it's chaotic complexity. So then he says, what else does he say?
However, it then states that since the universe is so complicated and ordered, it
just like the watch is,
it too must have had a creator.
Yep.
Thus, it gives the universe 2 incompatible and contradicting qualities.
Which I've set out. I've straighten this crumble, this wrinkle. So it's not self-refuting. It's not contradictory.
The watchmaker argument doesn't imply a designer. It implies that there are many designers.
Bro, so if you want to simplify this as if I'm speaking to a 6th grader.
After finding that watch upon the ground.
No, push pause.
Many designers.
Okay. So the whole point is, you see a watch, you see it has complexity that's ordered, you infer that it had a watchmaker. You see a cup, it's not complex to you, but to someone who doesn't know anything about design, sees a cup and says, wow, I don't got to use my hands. That's super complex. They infer that there's a cup maker. They don't say, oh wow, I just came from a backwater third world country where we have no type of architecture whatsoever. You know, I'm so glad that this matter reorganized itself into something useful for a purpose, to drink water or liquid. No, they say, whoa, who made this? You know? So from watch to watchmaker, cup to cup maker, car to car maker, TV maker, Game of Thrones to RR. I can't do that. And but you see where I'm getting here. Then it goes for bigger fish, from the minnows to the sharks, you know. Life to a life maker. What's the word I'm looking for? Ordered complexity of physics to a physics maker, etc. And all the way to an orderly universe to an orderly creator.
After finding that watch upon the ground, imagine if you then saw beside it a shoe. Would you assume that a watchmaker made that shoe? Of course not. You would assume that a shoemaker made it. Therefore, according to the analogy, life must have a life maker, suns must have a sun maker, and so on and so forth, implying that there are many creators rather than just one.
Which is his fallacy in the fact that he has a misrepresentation of his thinking or of the argument, because he's assuming that there's many designers. But once again, because it's not a false cause, it is not a false cause fallacy, we are assuming here that it's attributable to a common cause, that they all had the same thing in the ultimate hierarchy sense, that all of it comes from a supreme being.
Of course, one creator could be responsible for creating more than one thing.
Oh, thank you.
But until demonstrated, that is still just an assumption.
This is actually true. I'm not going to argue. I like how he became Ghostface. Not Ghostface. He has a ghost face though. But yeah, that part is true. That's why you make that's why you, how do I put it? That's why you use philosophical argumentation, hint hint, based on whatever theology that you have, Christian or not.
The watchmaker argument acts as if a watchmaker creates a watch from nothing.
Lies. I'm sorry. I've been watching too much Game of Thrones. So, sorry, I would think about Jon Snow on the Night Watch. Spoilers. #spoilers. So, the argument acts as if a watchmaker creates a watch from nothing when this simply isn't true. That's right. In the first chapter... Whoa. Okay, that's way too far. So, in the first chapter, it talks very specifically about how, let's see, to reckon the plainness of the parts, blah, 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 we see a cylindrical box containing a coiled elastic spring, which by its endeavor to relax itself turns around the box. We next observe a flexible chain, etc., etc. It's not talking about we see a watch, it came from nothing, it must be God of the gaps. No, it's saying obviously creatio, creatio ex materia, I think, which is creation from matter. So it's not saying creatio ex nihilo, but creatio ex materia. Now he does leave. Now, if you are going to assume, watch to watchmaker, universe to universe maker, then what one must understand is that he ends his argument from watch to watchmaker and physics to physics maker, or astronomy to astronomy to cosmos maker, you know, or astro maker, I guess you can say. He leaves it in such a way that that the universe can either be eternal, which in a sense he's still arguing via Newtonian mechanics of ordered complexity, or if you want to argue for creatio ex nihilo, then you can order that via Newtonian mechanics for ordered complexity of the universe. So this is a misrepresentation of the argument. I do dare say, certainly, because it doesn't say in the original that it has to be creatio ex nihilo. You can make philosophical arguments for this, for example, the Kalam cosmological argument. But other than that, the argument doesn't make any such claim. It leaves it for the reader to decide. Because at the time there were Christians that were, one may say, more liberal in their thinking, and did assume that even though science said that there was no Big Bang at the time, and that atoms were eternal, so the universe must be eternal. You had a differentiation between those Christians who believed that the universe was eternal and preferred Aquinas' argument for motion, argument for motion. And then you had those who preferred the Kalam cosmological style argumentation, for those who believed in the universe at the beginning. So, yeah, this doesn't apply whatsoever. I don't know why he put that there.
When this simply isn't true.
You're right. It's not true. This doesn't apply whatsoever.
Like all human creations, is a rearrangement of energy and matter that already existed.
True.
A watchmaker can't create a watch literally from nothing, and so the watchmaker argument can actually only argue that the designer of the universe rearranged energy and matter that already existed. The watchmaker argument doesn't support theism.
What are you talking about? You literally have an entire chapter dedicated to the personality of the deity, as he says, contravents, if established, appears to me to prove everything which we wish to prove. Amongst other things, it proves the personality of the deity as distinguished from what is sometimes called nature, sometimes called a principle, which terms in the mouths of those who use them philosophically seem to be intended to admit and to express an efficiency, but to exclude and to deny a personal agent. I wonder who is doing that. Okay, continuing on. I just became Chris Ray Gun. My oh my. So, now that which can contrive, which can design, must be a person. Not in the sense of a Homo sapien, but rather in the sense that it has a personality. What? Okay, here we go. These capacities constitute personality, for they imply consciousness and thought. They require that which can perceive an end or purpose, as well as the power of providing means and of directing them to their end. So, it does support theism in the sense that further on in this chapter and in the next chapter, which is titled the natural attributes of the deity and the unity of the deity, and then the next chapter, the goodness of the deity, and in the conclusionary chapter, it does support theism. As I said, he uses philosophical argumentation based on his Christian theology. It does support theism. Even if accepted as a sound argument, it doesn't support theism. Seriously.
Even if it were accepted to be a sound argument, it would only prove that the universe had a universe designer, and that's it. It would.
Did you see what he put there?
Prove that the universe had a universe designer, and that's it. It wouldn't prove a particular sound argument. It would.
Which it's not. So, him and I'm going to assume here, both agree that it's valid. The only thing we differ on is whether it's sound.
Only prove that the universe had a universe designer, and that's it. It wouldn't prove a particular religion to be true. Or, as Hitchens put it, Even if the Watchmaker argument was valid, you, as a theist, still have all of your work ahead of you.
Which is true. Which is why we don't have to do any of the work anymore, because it was done for us in the form of 226 minus 296. 43 in the form of 43 pages and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 chapters. So, yes, we would have had a lot of work to do, but thank God for William Paley, because the work's been done for us. Kind of like thank God for Christ, because we don't have to work our way to God anymore. God works his way to us. Thank God for Jesus too.
In addition to the Watchmaker argument not supporting theism, its logic is also inconsistent with the description of most monotheistic gods, and certainly the Abrahamic ones. An all-powerful and all-loving God would not create organisms with the type of
So with this argument, the quality of having almighty and unlimited power. Now, true. The reason we say that is because he, being the omnipotent God that we assume him to be, is that he has more power than we can possibly imagine. Therefore, we assume unlimited potential, or unlimited actual power, I should say.
Optimal design that can be.
And then omnibenevolent. So, quality of being loving in the sense that he loved us enough to create us, loved us enough not to take us at this very moment, because we are sinful in nature. Because when you do give people anarchy, they tend to commit a lot of sin, a lot of violence against their brethren. So, and yet good enough to permit a justice system afterlife, or afterlife justice. That is, that Hitler will be punished, communist regimes will be punished, anyone who's done evil and has not repented, will be punished. And, if that wasn't a thing, then life wouldn't be worth living. And, there'd be a lot of violence. So, continuing on.
Be seen in nature. From vestigial organs.
Oh, that's right. So, talking about vestigial organs, let's talk about that. That's the tailbone. Right here. The cox cable. That's what I'm going to call it. Cox cable. So, if you see, our spine is not necessarily straight, but has a curvature. Due to our curvature, if we didn't have the cox cable, we would not be walking perfectly. Now, it's not to say that you cannot walk without a cox cable, but rather that if you have not learned how to walk before your cox cable has been destroyed or broken, then you would have difficulty learning how to walk. So this helps us, how do I put it? This helps us balance us, kind of like a tail, but not necessarily. It's more of a, so it serves two purposes. One, for this butte, and to help balance our spine because of our curvature. But it also helps stabilize people when you're like sitting down. So like if you're sitting in the air, then that helps you stabilize. But I just remembered that I had a discussion with a nurse that I know. And apparently there are muscles here that connect to the pelvic area. So apparently this is not necessarily necessary, but useful for baby making. So yeah, we're just going to go ahead and continue.
To birth defects,
Oh yes, when it comes to birth defects and pregnancies, complications, him being Paley, actually made a caveat to this, and this is what he says. His second and his fifth, I think, or no, let's just start with his second. So, Neither, secondly, would it invalidate our conclusion that the watch sometimes went wrong or that it seldom went right. The purpose of the machinery, the designer, might be evident, and in the case supposed where would be evident in whatever way we accounted for the irregularity of the movement, or whether we could account for it or not. It is not necessary that a machine be perfect in order to show with what design it was made. Still less necessary where the only question is whether it were made with any design or not. With any design at all. Nor, thirdly, would it bring any uncertainty into the argument if there were a few parts of the watch concerning which we could not discover, or had not yet discovered, in what manner they conducted to the general effect, or even some parts concerning which we could not ascertain whether they conducted to that effect in any manner or not, i.e., or e.g., vestigial organs. For as to the first branch of the case, if by the loss or disorder or decay of the parts in question, the movement of the watch were found to be in fact to be stopped, whereas someone just dropped dead in the literal sense, or disturbed, where you have mental cases, for example, what I would believe to be transsexuality, or retarded, in the sense we have mental retardation, no doubt would remain in our minds as to the utility or intention of these parts, although we should be unable to investigate the manner according to which, or the connection by which, the ultimate effect depended upon their action or assistance. And the more complex the machine is, the more likely this is obscurity to arise. So, in other words, he's saying, which is true, which is why warranty was created. The more complex a machine is, the more likely that even if it's properly made and everything was built in the proper way, it's more likely the more complex it is. So let me rephrase it. The more complex the machine is, even if built properly, even if built properly, the more complex it is, the more likely it is of a malfunction occurring. Human beings are the most advanced biological machine to existence that we know of, and being the most advanced, being the most complex, the complex of all complex machineries, that's biological, you can therefore assume that because we are the most complex, there is a likelihood of malfunction, as however unfortunate as it is. And God could have prevented it. He could have prevented people from stopping to drop dead, but he didn't, and he has a reason for that we don't know of. And he could have stopped cancer, but there's a reason that he didn't, that we just don't know of. And pregnancy complications that we simply don't know of. And, I say that because, never mind, we'll just go ahead and continue.
Pregnancy complications, it cannot logically follow that an all-powerful, all-loving God can be responsible for this.
It can. All-powerful in the sense that he could have stopped it, but willingly decided not to, for whatever his reasons are, because we're just ants on a mound hill, and God is the person standing above, who created the mound hill and everything in it, and above and beneath, and literally everything. And so we only see what's in front of us, and we can only see so far ahead, but he sees it all. And so for whatever reason, his reason may be, he just allowed it. And we know from Christian theology that he never permits something to happen unless he has a morally sufficient reason. So,
meaning that
also an all-loving God could not stop it. Well, you don't know to say that maybe that person, let's say who had cancer, would have actually had a life of suffering. Let's say a child who had cancer and died prematurely at, let's say, 5 years old. The let's say, for example, that God decided to do that because he knew that if this little girl was born and lived a full life of, let's say, 112 years, perhaps he foresaw that the life would be nothing but disaster and nothing but tribulation and toughness, and she would not succeed. And so instead of letting her do that and her disregarding and disobeying God, thus separating her from him and condemning her to hell, he rather gave her cancer. So, and in that she did have appreciation as a young child for God, and died in belief of God, accepted Jesus as the Lord and Savior, and so in doing so saved her everlasting soul. So this is just, of course, one example out of many other hypotheticals, but this is something to consider. If God does something, or does not stop something and permits it, then we know from Christian theology he does it for a morally sufficient reason, even if we don't know what that reason is.
If the Watchmaker argument was valid, this would mean that the God that created the universe is either not omnipotent or not omnibenevolent, or...
As I said, it does not logically conclude that he cannot be either one or both, because this is called the black-white fallacy. It's either he's not one of these or he's none of them at all. That's false, because there are more options. Either he's not one of these, he's none of them, or he perhaps permitted it for, like mercy, because the future could have been bad, or, just something like that in the examples I give. What he's giving right now is a black and white fallacy.
Or both. So, to recap, the Watchmaker argument is flawed because it's a false analogy, it commits a false cause fallacy, it completely ignores evolution by natural selection, it commits a special pleading fallacy, or it's completely self-refuting, it's self-contradicting, it doesn't imply a designer, but rather many designers, it acts as if watches are created from nothing, it doesn't support theism, and it doesn't support the concept of an omnipotent and omnibenevolent God. It's not a sound argument.
So actually, I have answered all of his questions, and I say questions rather than objections, because any and all objections start from a question. So if it's a question, it has to be answered. For example, let's take the Creatio ex nihilo. It didn't start out like, no, the Watchmaker argument acts as if a watchmaker creates a watch from nothing, when this simply isn't true, but rather it starts out like, wait a minute, isn't that acting as if it just comes out of nothing, Creatio ex nihilo? And then the objection is created. So in reality, any and all objections are in essence at their core questions unanswered. So now that I've answered all of his questions, all of his 9 points in showing why the argument is unsound, since we both believe it's valid, because it is now sound, or in the sense that I've answered all of his objections and none of them no longer apply, and I've actually never replied, because there's no more objections that I see at the moment regarding him, it is now a sound argument. And Stephen, if you want to email me, or you want to text me, we can have a discussion about you just coming into the faith, since, as you say here,
in fact, it's thoroughly debunked.
Yes, debunked as in your questions are now answered, because if they were true objections, then your objections would be debunked.
As you might have noticed, this video is quite a bit longer than many of my others, but to be perfectly honest with you, I think it needed to be. While the Watchmaker argument is thoroughly flawed, it is nevertheless what I personally consider to be one of the best arguments for a deity that has ever been.
Exactly. Hence the reason, because there are no more questions to be answered, i.e. no more objections raised, it is now technically a sound argument, and I would like to have a discussion with you, if you wouldn't mind, about Jesus. Not in a philosophical sense, we could, but rather in a theological sense, Simply put, have you ever lied? If the answer is yes, then you're a liar. If you ever have you ever lusted after a woman after your heart? Jesus said that if you have, then you're an adulterer. And if you said yes, then you're an adulterer. So if you said yes to those, then you're a lying adulterer. And if we had to put you, and if you were before the righteous judge, who has no unrighteousness in him, that is, then being the good judge that he is, he will have to condemn you. The punishment must come after the crime. And you've committed the crime of lying and being an adulterer. So the punishment obviously is eternal separation, which is condemnation to hell, the second death. So would you rather that? Or now the reason I say this is because there is another person, Jesus, who comes out and actually argues for your case. Because if you do accept him into your life, he does argue for you when the day comes, on the day of judgment, and he says, no, all that is clean. He accepted me, and he's a part of my family. He has no blemishes. And God looks at his book, the Father, and doesn't see any sin, and says, you know what, you're right. You're free to go. And you walk out of, quote unquote, you walk out the doors of free men and into everlasting paradise. And so that's something I would like to discuss with you, if you wouldn't mind. Or if not, then I would like for you to, just reach out to a local pastor in the UK and, talk more about it.
And hence, it deserved this royal kick-in.
And hence, it deserved the royal defense.
Thanks for the view, and I'll leave you with this overwhelmingly powerful argument to consider.
No, I'm okay, thank you. But you're welcome for the view. So, as I was saying, Stephen, Jesus gives us a chance of repentance, The Bible is very clear. It states that if you confess with your mouth the Lord Jesus, which essentially says if you confess that Jesus is your Lord and you acknowledge him, that he is Lord overall, and you believe in your heart that God the Father has raised him from the dead, you will be saved. Simply because with the heart one believes unto righteousness, and with the mouth confession is made unto salvation. For the scripture says, whoever believes on him will not be put to shame. For there is no distinction between the Jew and the Greek, or in other words, there's no the difference between the Jew and the non-Jew. For the same Lord over all is rich to all who call upon him. For whoever calls upon the name of the Lord shall be saved. Simple as that. So I would like to invite you, Stephen, to seriously consider Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior. I would like to emphasize that. If you would like to have a discussion, I'm still learning pastoral-wise, but if you would like to have that discussion, I would be willing and happy to have it with you. Preferably, though, in person, only because I would like to visit the UK, but sometimes some things aren't practical. I would love a video call, a phone call, text message, and email where we can talk about this. I love you, Stephen, as one human being to another. And to everyone else, I'm going to end this video. I love all of you from one human being to another. My voice is starting to get tired. And the pregnancy complications did hit me hard because of the death of my baby sister due to a complication in pregnancy. So it's nothing, when I do say that and I talk about that, it's not that I'm being cruel. It's just that I've lived through that before, and you just got to keep pressing on. You got to live your life. So I love all of you guys. Yeah. So YouTube demands that I say like, comment, and subscribe. Share if you want, whatever. But I couldn't care less so long as people are at least watching it and having a productive conversation. I love all of you. Peace be with you.